Just a few hours ago in Shanghai, something happened that nobody inside Formula One expected. A rookie. Only 19 years old. Second race weekend of his career. Just delivered the fastest lap of qualifying. Kimi Antonelli put the Mercedes on pole position for the Chinese Grand Prix. But the real drama started after the session ended. Because while Mercedes celebrated, engineers from other teams began analyzing the telemetry from that lap. And what Red Bull reportedly found in the data immediately raised eyebrows across the paddock. Not accusations. Not protests. But serious technical questions. Because Antonelli's lap was not just fast. It was almost too efficient. Perfect corner exits. Unusually strong acceleration. And on the longest straight in Shanghai, the Mercedes looked almost untouchable. Meanwhile, the rest of the grid was struggling. Ferrari could not match the deployment. McLaren could not match the straight line speed. And Red Bull, the team that dominated the previous era of Formula One, was nowhere near the front. Max Verstappen could only qualify 8th. His teammate Isaac Hadjar finished 9th. Both Red Bulls more than 1.5 seconds behind the fastest Mercedes lap. In modern Formula One, that kind of gap is enormous. And that is exactly why engineers immediately began studying Antonelli's lap sector by sector. Because if the data is correct, Mercedes may have already solved the biggest technical puzzle of the new regulation era. Energy management. How to recover power more efficiently. How to deploy that energy perfectly. And how to maintain acceleration longer than any other car on the grid. But here is where the story becomes even more dramatic. Because according to reports circulating inside the paddock tonight, Red Bull engineers believe the telemetry from Antonelli's lap may reveal something the rest of the field has not yet understood. Something hidden in how the Mercedes uses its hybrid system. Something that could explain why the W17 suddenly looks so dominant. So the question everyone in Formula One is asking tonight is simple. Did Kimi Antonelli just deliver the lap of a lifetime? Or did Red Bull uncover new evidence that could put Mercedes under serious pressure after qualifying in China? The moment qualifying ended in Shanghai, the atmosphere inside the paddock changed almost instantly. At first, the focus was obvious. Kimi Antonelli. A 19-year-old rookie. Second race weekend of his career. And suddenly, he was sitting on pole position for the Chinese Grand Prix. Inside the Mercedes garage, the reaction was pure celebration. Front row lockout. Antonelli first. George Russell second. A result that confirmed what many analysts were already starting to suspect. The Mercedes W17 might be the strongest car under the new regulations. But while the Mercedes mechanics were celebrating, engineers in other garages were already doing something else. They were studying the data. In modern Formula One, telemetry analysis begins almost immediately after qualifying ends. Every team compares speed traces, throttle application, brake pressure, energy deployment. They look for patterns. For small clues that reveal how a rival car is extracting performance. Normally those differences are small. A little more speed through one corner. A slightly earlier throttle application somewhere else. But when Red Bull engineers started overlaying Antonelli's lap with the data from other cars, something interesting appeared. The Mercedes was not just fast. It was extremely consistent. Sector after sector, the car was gaining time in places where most teams were struggling. Through the long opening sequence of corners. Under heavy braking. And especially on the final sector of the Shanghai circuit. This sector is one of the most complex parts of the entire track. It begins with a series of long, loaded corners that test rear stability. Then it ends with one of the longest straights on the Formula One calendar. Which means the car must balance two very different requirements. Strong aerodynamic grip in the corners. And perfect hybrid energy deployment on the straight. Most teams struggle to combine both. But during Antonelli's lap, the Mercedes seemed to do exactly that. As he exited the final corner and applied throttle, the W17 accelerated with incredible consistency. The speed trace looked unusually smooth. No sudden drop in acceleration. No early loss of electrical boost. Just continuous power all the way down the straight. For rival engineers, that detail immediately raised curiosity. Because under the new power unit regulations, energy management has become one of the most difficult technical challenges in the sport. Every car must recover energy under braking, store it in the battery, and deploy it at exactly the right moment during the lap. If the system deploys energy too aggressively, the car runs out of boost before the end of the straight. If the deployment is too conservative, the car loses acceleration when exiting corners. Finding the perfect balance is incredibly difficult. And most teams are still experimenting with different strategies. But the data from Antonelli's lap suggested that Mercedes may already have found a very effective solution. Which is exactly why Red Bull engineers became so interested in the telemetry. Because if the Mercedes can maintain electrical boost longer than the competition, the advantage becomes enormous. Not just in qualifying, but during the race as well. And this is where the contrast with Red Bull becomes even more dramatic. Because while Mercedes looked calm and efficient, the RB22 looked extremely difficult to drive. Max Verstappen described the car in very harsh terms during the weekend. Unstable when entering corners, floating through the middle of the turn, and lacking traction on corner exit. Those issues explain why the Red Bull struggled so much in qualifying. Verstappen could only manage 8th place. His teammate Isaac Hadjar finished 9th. Both cars more than 1.5 seconds behind Antonelli's pole lap. For a team that dominated the previous generation of cars, that result shocked the paddock. But the bigger concern for Red Bull was not just the gap. It was where the gap appeared. Because when engineers compared the telemetry from both cars, the Mercedes seemed to gain most of its advantage in areas directly related to energy deployment and traction. Which suggests that the W17 may have achieved something extremely important. A perfect balance between chassis stability and hybrid power delivery. That combination is incredibly powerful under the new regulations. Because a car that exits corners cleanly can deploy energy earlier. And the earlier the deployment begins, the higher the top speed becomes by the end of the straight. That chain reaction is exactly what rival engineers believe they may be seeing in the data. But inside the Mercedes garage, the reaction to these discussions has been very calm. From their perspective, there is nothing unusual about Antonelli's lap. The car is simply working as designed. The hybrid system is efficient. And the driver delivered an exceptional performance. But in Formula One, when one team suddenly appears to have an advantage under brand new regulations, curiosity spreads quickly. Every team begins searching for answers. Every sector time is analyzed. Every telemetry trace becomes part of the puzzle. And tonight, after qualifying for the Chinese Grand Prix, that puzzle is only becoming more fascinating. Because the data from Antonelli's pole lap may reveal something far bigger than just one great qualifying performance. It may reveal that Mercedes has already unlocked the most important technical advantage of the new Formula One era. But the more the engineers studied Antonelli's pole lap, the more the story started to grow. Because the advantage of the Mercedes was not just about top speed. It started much earlier in the lap. Right at the moment the driver touched the throttle. One of the most important parts of the Shanghai circuit is the exit of the final corner. A long right-hand turn that leads directly onto the massive back straight. Drivers spend several seconds balancing the car there. Too aggressive on the throttle, and the rear tires spin. Too cautious, and the car loses momentum before the straight even begins. Most drivers showed small corrections in that corner. Tiny steering adjustments. Micro lifts of the throttle. But Antonelli's Mercedes looked incredibly stable. The car stayed planted. No visible corrections. No hesitation. And that allowed Antonelli to apply full throttle earlier than almost anyone else. That detail may sound small. But in Formula One, small details become huge advantages. Because when a driver accelerates earlier at the start of a straight, the car carries that extra speed for the entire distance. And Shanghai has one of the longest straights in the sport. So the effect multiplies. Earlier throttle. Earlier energy deployment. Higher speed by the end of the straight. And when engineers from rival teams compared the speed traces, that pattern became very clear. The Mercedes was not only deploying energy efficiently, it was also exiting the corner faster, which created a chain reaction of performance. But that discovery created another interesting question inside the paddock. Why is the Mercedes able to apply throttle earlier? The answer may lie in the balance of the car itself. Because the W17 appears to have one of the most stable rear ends on the grid. Under braking, the car remains calm. Through the middle of the corner it stays planted. And when the driver applies throttle, the rear tires maintain traction. That stability gives the driver confidence. And confidence allows earlier acceleration. Earlier acceleration means earlier energy deployment. And that is exactly where the Mercedes seems to gain its advantage. But the contrast with Red Bull makes the situation even more dramatic. Because while the Mercedes looks stable and predictable, the RB22 appears extremely nervous. Max Verstappen described the car as very difficult to drive. Unstable on entry. Floating through the middle of corners. And lacking traction when exiting slow turns. Those characteristics make it almost impossible for a driver to attack the throttle early. And if the driver must wait even half a second longer before accelerating, the time loss becomes massive by the end of the straight. That is exactly what the telemetry comparison from qualifying suggests. The RB22 is not just slower. It is losing momentum at the exact moment where the lap time begins to build. Which explains why the gap to Mercedes looked so dramatic. Max Verstappen could only qualify 8th. Isaac Hadjar finished 9th. Both Red Bull cars more than 1.5 seconds behind Antonelli's pole lap.